Time for focus, and today we're looking at what's behind recent protests in Tunisia. The North African country managed to peacefully transition to democracy, but reviving the economy is proving difficult. At the start of the year, austerity measures and tax increases came into effect, this in a country with high inflation and high unemployment. The jobs market is particularly bad in the south of the country. Chris Moore went there to meet some university graduates.
Another trip to the job centre for Hinda. She graduated from university with a master's degree in accountancy, but that was 14 years ago. Now, aged 40, she's still yet to find work.
The job centre is supposed to be helping us. I have no problem with you personally. I know you two were out of work for 14 years. But you need to tell the employment minister that the system just isn't working.
Gafsa was one of the first areas to rise up during Tunisia's revolution at the start of the decade. And protests over unemployment and poverty go back further than that. These days, 1 in 3 graduates remains out of a job, the highest rate in the country. But the regional governor insists the situation is improving.
The socio-economic indicators for 2017 were better than the year before, and 2016 was an improvement on 2015, so we hope this year will be the best of them all.
But any improvements have failed to benefit Henda and her group of friends. Outside the local education authority, they've set up a protest camp.
We went on hunger strike here for 21 days. These are the conditions university graduates are living in. They've been here 4 years. When we were students, we thought it was a good investment, a way of paying back our parents. I did it for my father. There's nothing in Gafsa. The region is dead.
These graduates are still dreaming of a public sector job. But for this representative of Islamist Party Ennahda, part of the governing coalition, the ideal of the state as provider needs to change.
If we keep on with this idea that everybody can be a civil servant, we're heading straight into the wall. People can't progress that way. Look at Europe, it's the private sector that drives jobs.
But many unemployed graduates we meet tell us bureaucracy makes starting your own business very difficult. These images are from 2015. 3 years on, Nabil's situation hasn't changed. A qualified teacher, he's still unemployed and ashamed of it.
Since the Ben Ali era, all we've asked for is bread. I'm 40 years old. I go home late and leave the house early so that my family won't say, look, he's still unemployed. When I'm there, I sneak into the kitchen to eat a piece of bread so they can't say, look, he's unemployed and eating. That's the point we've got to.
Tunisia's revolution demanded freedom, work and dignity. Progress on the first has been held up as a rare Arab Spring success story. Many people here are still waiting for the rest.
And France 24's Chris Moore is now here with me in the studio. Hello, Chris. Now, your focus report there, focusing on university graduates because many of them took to the streets earlier this month then to protest against the economy.
That's right, yes, and particularly in the interior of the country there, the south of the country, it's the less wealthy part of the country. It's a problem, I think it's about 25 to 30% graduate unemployment there. And as you saw from the lady we interviewed, Henda, out of work for 14 years since graduating, and that's not a particularly unusual situation. The system is churning out a lot of graduates who simply can't find work. You were talking about the protests there. It's kind of become cyclical, really. There have been protests most years in Tunisia since the revolution. There were protests often at the beginning of the year before the revolution, often over things like price rises, and that was the trigger this time round. But increasingly, It's a time of year when people vent their frustration at a slew of economic concerns, and there is a growing sense of frustration, really, that, as you heard in the report, the revolution delivering to an extent on people's demand for freedom, but people increasingly frustrated at the failure of what is now, I think, 9 separate administrations since the revolution to address these underlying economic causes. It's often young people who are out in the streets expressing their anger, but particularly this time round, the austerity measures brought in at the start of the year also involved tax rises, for example, for the middle classes. The middle classes are feeling increasingly squeezed. It does seem that each time people take to the streets, that anger kind of goes up a notch. And at the moment, it's kind of on a yearly basis.
So how does Tunisia go about fixing its economic problems?
Well, there are many of them. As we've said, we talked about unemployment as a problem. There are deep structural issues as well, many of which haven't improved since the revolution. I think the debt as a proportion of GDP has increased from about 40% at the time of the revolution to about 70% now. There's a problem of a weak currency. How you fix it? Well, it kind of depends where you stand politically, really. There's what the IMF solution. The Tunisian government is the beneficiary of a series of loans from the IMF. As usual, they come with strings attached. They've been demanding the kind of reforms which you could argue, depending on where you stand, have or haven't worked in other countries. Kind of the usual really. It's austerity measures. It's cuts to the public sector. Tax rises in this case. Many of those out on the streets, a lot of the activists will tell you that they've been proved not to work in other countries. It's just punishing the poor unnecessarily. But I think what you did see there is perhaps the governing coalition increasingly trying to put across this message really of a change in mentality. We can't carry on churning out graduates who want public sector jobs. They say we need to try and stimulate business. We need to try and get more people setting up more graduates, particularly setting up their own businesses. But as you heard from one of the people we interviewed, they tried to go and to set up their own business. They said that the corruption, red tape had made them effectively give up hope. Corruption is another thing which people have complained about since the revolution.
Tunisia, though, still held up as a relative success story of the Arab Spring, so there must be some cause for optimism.
Well, yeah, I mean, you heard the slogan there, freedom, work and dignity. There was some complaint this time around during those protests about the police crackdown, that they were backsliding towards the methods of the former regime, but most people you speak to are much more worried about the latter two these days, work and dignity, the fact that these economic promises haven't been fulfilled. Nobody this time around, or pretty much nobody, was actually calling for the fall of the government. They just want the government to work for them. But as I said, it has become a cyclical thing. It tends to kick off at the start of the year. Causes for optimism, obviously, the country hasn't descended into the kind of chaos we've seen in some of its North African neighbours, notably Libya. It's a country that's got a relatively high-performing education system. Education levels are pretty good. The population is a little bit older, for example, than it is in Egypt. Obviously, when you have a lot of young people, that tends to lead to economic problems. But there's also been, every time it looks like the country may turn the corner, there's another series of protests, another series of price rises. And then, for example, the tourism sector, which should be a major driver of the economy, still hasn't recovered from a series of terrorist attacks back in 2015.
All right, thank you very much, Chris, for telling us more about the situation in Tunisia. Chris Moore joining us there for today's Focus.